Hello and welcome to our presentation about the foundations of secure cyber infrastructure in an IoT and IPv6 era. Our team is composed of Dr. Cyprian Popoviciu, who is an industry-recognized IPv6 expert, advisor, and trainer. Dr. Popoviciu led the development of IPv6 Forum Gold certified training programs in IPv6 and IPv6 security. He's an expert for the European Commission on next generation IT infrastructures research. As to myself, my name is Samir Toot from Eastern Michigan University. I have been focusing my research on AI, machine learning, as well as IoT and vehicle cybersecurity. I also recently co-led the successful completion of an NSF SATC grant to detect anomalies in smart grid environments. We also have Lola Killey. Ms. Killey has worked in computer networking for over 30 years. She designed and led Merit Network's IPv6 readiness program for its higher educational institutions. Ms. Killey trained over 330 IT professionals on IPv6 adoption. These are the topics we're going to cover, and today, as in segment 1, which is a part of a 3-part presentation on security considerations for next generation infrastructure. So at the overlap between IT and OT, the Internet of Things sits to provide key functionalities that are foundational to modern cyber infrastructure. We have the 3 pillars that we're all familiar with: computing, data storage, and networking. We can look at these within the context of the data layer or the functional layer. In the former, computing addresses when data is being processed, data storage addresses when it is at rest, and network connectivity addresses when it is being transferred. In the latter, i.e. functional layer, we are addressing the processing power, the storage capacity, and network throughput, respectively. Now, IoT comes in to our conventional computing world and adds new capabilities such as remote access and sensing. For instance, having a sensor sit in the middle of the desert, collecting data for scientists to explore and analyze. Another capability is monitoring, where cameras are but one example of such capabilities. And we also have configuration and troubleshooting, which are now done remotely in many cases, which a few decades ago required considerable infrastructure investments. This has led to new abilities, and even some may argue that they've led to a new turf in terms of infrastructure, whereby the physical world has now become amenable to further interpretation at various levels using such equipment, which has come in quite handy in supporting decisions that again would have otherwise required tremendous investments. IoT has also emerged in parallel with other supportive technologies that have either coincided with it and have made it more viable or were practically created to support it. One of these is SD-WAN, which enables centralized access management at a global scale. We'll briefly address this later in this presentation. Now let us look together at the main verticals or tiers that are involved in an IoT-supported infrastructure. First, on the left, we have the sensors that are collecting data from the physical world in the form of attributes thereof. Then we have the actuators, which include logic that is built to utilize such data and take actions accordingly. In the second vertical tier, we have equipment that interact with those sensors and actuators, some aggregating their data, then some acting as conduits or gateways to transfer, albeit sometimes with some translations, and do that transfer across what is referred to as the edge, i.e. the border that separates this IoT world from its IT counterpart. Beyond that edge is where we start seeing the classic processing power and communication infrastructure that finally communicates all associated data into the last tier, which is the data center or cloud environments. As we can see, the data flows downstream, if you will, while the control flows the opposite way. Direction through configuration commands, etc., are sent from respective applications and routed up to the IoT devices. Now, an important and very intriguing aspect of IoT is that its real time starts way before that of IT, obviously in milliseconds, etc., as it lives upstream. The immediate side effect is that a compromise in the IoT tier, such as, for example, a false data injection attack, which we were actually able to initiate and analyze in an IoT sensor and actuator filled modern home. We had an experiment that we conducted, multiple experiments in a modern home environment as part of that NSF grant that I mentioned earlier. And we were able to initiate false data injections within the IoT environment. But such attacks in this context that we're talking about may eventually leak down to one or more of the IT tiers. This has really introduced a paradigm shift in general perimeter security and in cyber infrastructure, especially after hackers started targeting IoT devices to pivot into the actual corporate / cyber infrastructure for various nefarious goals. Now, some shift left advocates have promoted moving parts of the vast IT capabilities found in the data center and cloud tier, such as high performance computing, virtualization, enterprise system management, etc., to process IoT data at the edge, therefore potentially reducing latency, improving reliability, etc., which are clear advantages. However, this may well exacerbate the security concerns as we are now shifting more horsepower towards the tiers that are more susceptible to attacks, therefore possibly giving way for more devastating attacks that may pivot back to the IT tier or tiers. I will shortly give an example of an IoT-based attack that has been active for years and exhibits what I just mentioned. Now, the recent years have witnessed a surge in attacks that target IoT devices, thus becoming the most common cyber attack vector. Again, mostly with the goal to pivot over to the corporate IT cyber infrastructure. This is mainly because of the broadly ill-equipped protection on such small and mostly constrained devices. The key point here is that this is becoming more and more relevant to all cyber infrastructures, of which the maintainers, the designers, and the users may not even be aware that they are connected somehow to a smart quote-unquote thing or even supported by it. There are many such examples, including cameras, routers, thermostats, and so on, which eventually may lead to an attack that practically evades traditional perimeter and endpoint security solutions, thus sometimes rendering them even useless and preventing certain IoT-based attacks. According to Nokia's 2018 Threat Intelligence Report, there is a considerable percentage of malware activity that was related to IoT botnets. In fact, they state that 35% of those were Mirai variants, and I will go over what Mirai is shortly. And 16% of infected devices overall were actual IoT devices. If you remember the SD-WAN based appliances that I mentioned toward the beginning, these, along with home appliances and other digital equipment, have also become targets of new strains of that malware. An important point to keep in mind is that manufacturers are always, or most of the time, keen to add connectivity nearly every new product every new product, because they would like to basically gain that competitive edge. And these products are sometimes rushed to the market to gain that competitive advantage. And then what is mostly sacrificed? It's security, unfortunately. So rather quickly, what is Mirai? It is a bot that is based on an agent handler model, and that you have a command and control server that provides support for the bots as well as for users and admins. Second, the bot itself is composed of multiple components for scanning, terminating, and attacking other nodes within the infrastructure. Then you have the reporting and loading servers. Not to go into too many details about this, but suffice to say that such an advanced architecture is now getting built into actual bots that compromise IoT infrastructures, which could pivot over to IT infrastructures. Furthermore, that same report actually uncovered three main IoT risk areas to consider: authorization, identity, and access management. So when auditing your cyber infrastructure, it's always a good idea to identify if there are default credentials, for example, that are still lingering and may be exploited. This risk actually accounted for about 25% of the cases. One option to prevent this risk is possibly by using multi-factor authentication. The second risk area is around vulnerabilities, resulting from not keeping up-to-date patching of every IoT and other devices that are connected to them. However, one thing to keep in mind in this context is that let's think about patching a power-constrained temperature sensor that is collecting data for researchers in the middle of the desert will not be that easy to update. And this risk actually accounted for about 32% of the cases. One way that has been suggested to deal with this is, which is now happening more and more, that these devices are using the cloud for updates. The third area is architecture and network segmentation. And this is at the core of the issue, whereby if there is no clear separation and segmentation between IoT and corporate infrastructures, then that is a recipe for disaster in cases like Mirai. This accounted also for 32% of the cases. Now, a possible solution to this is to segment access by utilizing DMZs. And this is outlined in NIST's IR 8228, which is titled Considerations for Managing IoT Cybersecurity and Privacy Risks. This is a great resource that I would recommend to all those working with cyber infrastructure connected to IoT devices in one way or another. Now, in conclusion, let's look at a few recommendations. For this segment that we've discussed about the key aspects of an IoT related infrastructure, and we talked about the security risks, but here are a few recommendations where conventional perimeter security is no longer enough by itself. Inventory every single IoT device, as well as their software. Leave no default credential within your infrastructure. Use strong authentication protocols. Define effective trust boundaries. Use good monitoring tools. Use IDS or IPS, intrusion detection or intrusion prevention. And then last but not least, user awareness training. I cannot stress this enough, and I'm sure most of these are things that most of you already know, but it's really important to remind everyone of these. Unfortunately, the known motto still applies that we are as strong as our weakest link. So CI admins/maintainers, designers, and users must receive continuous awareness training to avoid falling for example, a phishing attack that may lead to a compromise of the whole CI infrastructure.
Hello, my name is Ciprian Popovic, and I will continue this three-part presentation on security considerations for next-generation cyber infrastructures. In this module, I will cover IPv6, the next generation of the Internet Protocol. On one hand, we will discuss security considerations specific to the protocol. On the other, we will discuss the connection between IPv6 and IoT, which is the theme of this series of presentations. We are definitely living in a very interesting time. We're experiencing a perfect storm of technology change that impacts every aspect of our cyber infrastructures. We are seeing a wide range of applications which enable unprecedented productivity. We see the adoption of IoT, the Internet of Things, a topic that was covered by Dr. Toot in the first module. IoT is all about instrumentation, instrumenting the environment, instrumenting processes, instrumenting cyber infrastructures, ultimately collecting data and acting upon data. We are also seeing the adoption of cloud, which is essential in providing the agility necessary to develop, deploy, and operate new services on top of the cyber infrastructure. And in order to assure good user experience for all these services, it is important to have in the network the flexibility necessary to allocate the right resources needed by these services end to end. In this context, we developed software-defined networks and network functions virtualization. All these inflection points have a dramatic impact on the overall cyber infrastructure. All of them are happening at the same time, and all of them are interdependent. But for them to reach their full potential, they require a clean, scalable IP network, and that's where IPv6 comes into play. The most important resource in the Internet Protocol that enables connectivity between devices is the IP address. For many years, the demand for IP addresses was driven by users. However, most recently, the demand for IP address space is primarily driven by an exponential growth in the number of devices. A big driver for this demand, of course, is IoT. For this reason, the resources that are provided by IPv6 are seen as essential to the successful deployment of IoT. More specifically, IPv4 ran out of IP addresses. All the regional registries are out of globally routable IPv4 addresses. At the same time, a market has been developing for IPv4 addresses. On that market, one address is worth anywhere between $20 and $25. That might not seem a lot. However, in the economics of inexpensive sensors deployed at scale, $25 a piece represents a significant cost. But it's not all about addresses. It is also about a cleaner protocol. Whenever I talk about the evolution of IP, I like to use Stephen Deering's slides, which show the evolution of IP, starting from winning the war against the other layer 3 protocols, the development of new features and capabilities that added a lot of complexity to the protocol, the breaking of the end-to-end model by our work in reuse of address space, RFC 1919 particularly, and all that led to the need of creating the next generation of IP in a much cleaner, in a better way that leverages all the lessons learned from the development of IP and the operation of networks enabled by IP. So what is IPv6? Let's do a quick summary of the next generation of the Internet Protocol. First and foremost, we all decided that we want to make IPv6 an evolution, not a revolution of IP. This means that most of the concepts that we are familiar with in IPv4 do apply in the case of IPv6. Yes, we implemented some of the lessons learned. Yes, we added more address space. But overall, most of the concepts are similar. However, it is important to note that the differences between the two protocols, while subtle, can have significant impact in terms of developing new designs, new architectures for cyber infrastructures, not only in terms of transport, but also in terms of cybersecurity. It is also important to acknowledge the fact that IPv6 is the plan of record for the industry, which means that if we deploy an infrastructure today that is not IPv6 based, we are deploying legacy. It is also important to note that IPv6, while a layer 3 protocol, does touch almost every layer of the OSI stack. And because of that, whenever we deploy IPv6, whenever we build our IPv6 security architectures, IPv6 has to be taken into consideration almost at every layer. This is a topic that we will cover in more detail in one of the subsequent slides. And then finally, IPv6 is not compatible with IPv4. We did that on purpose in order to enable us to change the wheels on the bus while the bus is running. At the same time, this means that we will run two protocol stacks on our cyber infrastructures for a period of time during which we're going to have to manage two distinct stacks. Let's talk about protocol security specifically. And while we do not have time to go into all the details, what we are going to do is we are going to highlight the key differences. So despite the myth that IPv6 is more secure than IPv4, the reality is that IPv6 is no better or not worse than IPv4 when it comes to security. Usually, the challenges, the shortcomings when it comes to security are due to product implementations, feature implementation, inconsistencies in products. Those are the primary causes for a decreased security stance of cyber infrastructures. It is also important to note that those changes, those differences between the two protocols, those optimizations and improvements that showed up in IPv6 do have an impact on the overall architecture of infrastructures and on the respective cybersecurity architecture. The way to think about protocol security when it comes to IPv6 is that most of the vulnerabilities that are present in IPv4 are present in IPv6 as well. Of course, the protocol differences mean that some vulnerabilities in IPv4 are not going to be present in IPv6, but at the same time, some changes in IPv6 protocol led to new vulnerabilities that are specific to IPv6. The same Venn diagram applies to all the features and capabilities that have been developed in order to address these differences between the vulnerabilities that affect the two protocols. So let's go into a little bit more detail and talk about various considerations across the OSI layers. Layer 1 and Layer 2 typically see very little IPv6 influence. But of course, at Layer 2, IPv6 does use several dedicated MAC addresses, both unicast and multicast, for control plane implementation. And for those reasons, even though IPv6 is a Layer 3 protocol, when implementing security at Layer 2, IPv6 considerations must be taken into account. The next piece to address is that shim layer that IPv4 created between Layer 2 and Layer 3, which is called ARP, which maps Layer 2 addresses to Layer 3 addresses. Now, in the case of IPv6, we did a better job in cleaning that up, removing that shim layer and implementing that capability, that functionality straight into Layer 3 using ICMP. That functionality comes under Neighbor Discovery Protocol, and that functionality is much more complex and much more capable than ARP ever was. With this increased capability, of course, comes complexity. And that complexity has to be secured and has to be addressed because it opens the door for new vulnerabilities. Now, when we get to Layer 3, which is where IPv6 actually lives, we need to take into consideration several aspects of the protocol. On one hand, it's addressing. The IPv6 address space is not only big, but it also has a lot of structure. IPv6 addresses contain information that relates to scope and that relates to various types of capabilities. For this reason, it is very important to take into consideration the IPv6 addressing schema into the security architecture. At the same time, an IPv6 enabled interface can have multiple unicast, multicast addresses. And with this capability, we have new tools by which we can enforce zoning for the traffic that is generated by various hosts. Multicast is an intrinsic part of the protocol. It was there from day one and is a key component in implementing link layer control plane. This is why securing multicast is an important aspect of the overall security architecture. ICMP finally became what we always wanted it to be, a true control and management protocol. And because of that, a lot of the control plane in IPv6 runs on top of ICMP. This means that our view of ICMP and the way we secure it is completely different in IPv6 than it is in IPv4. Also, IPv6, anticipating the need for very inexpensive, low-resource devices to self-provision, borrow from AppleTalk key components, key concepts with regards to self-provisioning. Those capabilities, however, have to be explicitly secured in the case of IPv6. And then at upper layer protocols, of course, we should not see IPv6 related security measures or considerations. However, some poor implementations will lead to some vulnerabilities that relate to IPv6. But that's not protocol related, that's much more application related. Now, sensors can be anywhere on the spectrum of layers. They can be sensors that are IoT devices that are just at layer 1 and layer 2, in which case the IPv6 security architecture is going to focus primarily on the backhaul side of the IoT services. But more and more IoT devices are also implementing a layer 3, are deploying a TCP/IP stack, in which case we need to take into consideration all the security policies that need to be applied specifically for IPv6 in the context of reduced resources that characterize a layer 3 sensor. This is why one of the reasons why with IPv6 and end-to-end reachability, botnets similar to Mirai that was described in Module 1 become an important consideration. As we said, the primary reason why IPv6-enabled cyber infrastructures are vulnerable is the inconsistency in support for IPv6 across product lines. Leading manufacturers are doing a good job at being consistent and complete in their support of IPv6 security capabilities, even though sometimes might not be consistent over time. On the other hand, smaller, newer manufacturers might not have the capabilities, the resources, or the knowledge to implement IPv6 properly. This type of devices, this type of services become a significant vulnerability in the overall service architecture, in the overall cyber infrastructure. Open source projects are oftentimes lacking IPv6 focus and IPv6 expertise, and that leads to products that are incurring significant technology debt that require significant rework at the layer time in order to provide IPv6 capabilities and in order to secure them for an IPv6 infrastructure. So what does this mean for your cyber infrastructure projects? First and foremost, keep in mind the fact that IPv6 is the plan of record for the industry. So you must always build your cyber infrastructure, your services with IPv6 in mind. Securing IPv6 enabled infrastructure is similar but not identical to IPv4. So you need to understand the differences and deal with them. It is very important not to treat IPv6 independently of IoT. The two are connected, and a good, consistent cyber infrastructure that addresses both the deployment of IoT and of IPv6 is essential in the successful operation of both. And finally, let's not forget that as researchers, we should check off that box regarding IPv6 readiness of the research infrastructures that we want to deploy. Hello, my name is Ciprian Popovic, and this is the last segment in a three-part presentation on security considerations for next-generation cyber infrastructures. In the first module, we covered security considerations for the Internet of Things, while in the second segment, we covered security considerations for IPv6 specifically and the relationship between IPv6 and IoT. These concepts apply differently depending on the architecture and the technology used in the deployment of a specific IoT service. In this module, we will apply some of these concepts to a very specific example, LoRaWAN. For those unfamiliar with LoRaWAN architecture, this picture depicts the key elements of a LoRaWAN deployment. The sensors operate at layer 1, layer 2, so they are not IP enabled, and they communicate with one or multiple gateways, which represent the boundary between layer 2 and layer 3. From here, traffic is backhauled to network servers, which are responsible for managing the gateways and the communication between the nodes and the network servers. And then in turn, the traffic from the sensors is forwarded to application servers, which are responsible for both managing the sensors themselves and for managing the data that they provide in the context of the specific application which is served by this IoT deployment. It's very important, however, to note the clear separation between the layer 2 domain and the layer 3 domains in this end-to-end service architecture. In the LoRaWAN architecture depicted in the previous image, there is a very clear separation between the layer 2 and layer 3 domains. This means that we can focus our security policies based on the lessons learned in the previous modules within each specific domain. The IoT-specific considerations are applied to layer 2 domain, whereas the IPv6 specific security considerations are applied to the layer 3 domain. However, in the deployment of an end-to-end security architecture, it is also important to take into consideration the various admin domains that are traversed by the traffic from sensors all the way to data collection. For example, in the same image, the sensors and the gateways can belong to one organization. The traffic from the gateway to the network servers can cross multiple admin domains, including internet infrastructures. The network server can be a cloud service, whereas the application server can be a distinct cloud service, all participating in delivering this specific IoT service. It is important to understand not only the structure of the various admin domains, their security stance, but also their interaction. Most IoT technologies are implementing security-specific functionality. In the case of LoRaWAN, when an endpoint comes up, two distinct keys are going to be generated: a network session key and an application session key. The network session key is used specifically to ensure integrity for the communication between the sensor and the network server. And then the application security key is used specifically to encrypt the communication between the sensor and the application server. These added security functionalities specific to LoRaWAN need to be taken into consideration when building the end-to-end security architecture for the service. As we can see here, even though our expectation was that the IoT-specific security considerations will be applied only within the layer 2 domain, in fact, traffic and the traffic encapsulation implies that IoT-specific security considerations do cross boundaries beyond just the layer 2 domain. So with this in mind, in the context of LoRaWAN, let's review how specific security policies would be applied across the end-to-end service. With an understanding of the LoRaWAN architecture and LoRaWAN specific security features, it is now time to apply the concepts that were developed in the previous modules to securing the LoRaWAN deployment end-to-end. We split the security considerations into two categories: IoT specific and IPv6 specific. In the case of IoT security considerations, in order to leverage the security features of LoRaWAN, it is important to ensure a safe and proper management of encryption keys between sensors and network servers, and keys between sensors and application servers. It is also important to safeguard the information related to individual sensors, even though that might come to a cost with respect to the ease of self-provisioning. On the layer 3 domain, it's important to apply the IPv6 security best practices in securing the key hosts in the service delivery process: the gateways, the network servers, the application servers. It is important to secure these elements from illicit access and from DDoS attacks, which would impair the overall service. The transport between the elements can be secured using, again, IPv6 specific tools, security tools. It is important to remember that IPv6 addressing schemas can be developed in a way that will facilitate zoning for an IoT deployment such as the one described in this example. The LoRaWAN example provided in this section is, of course, just one instance of an IoT deployment with specific security features with specific considerations. We are looking forward to add additional examples in future modules that will describe even more diverse distributions of security capabilities between the IoT domain and the IPv6 domain. From East Carolina University, Eastern Michigan University, and Merit Network,